Excellent. Well, thank you everyone for coming to this human factors panel right after lunch. Nobody wants to talk about more than human factors after lunch. But we have a really a nice panel assembled here that's across a range of disciplines and sizes, so from startups through to multinationals. And I guess just to level set us before we get into it, just by a show of hands, how many people in the audience feel like they are experts on the topic of human factors, or this is something that you do a lot in your regular everyday job? Okay. So a handful. And for how many of you is this completely a new topic? Okay, so kind of a good mix there. We'll try to kind of cover all the bases from the basics through to a couple deeper topics. The way that we were thinking that we would run it is we'll go through, I'll lead a discussion for around 30 minutes or so, and then be thinking of questions. We'll open it up for audience questions. I should introduce myself. I'm Michael Neidert. I'm the VP of Strategic Development at Ximedica. So I am responsible for the business here on the West Coast. And let's go down the line and meet our panelists here. Maybe tell a little bit about who you are, your background, and what you do.
Sure. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Kevin Ten Brink. I'm currently at Intuitive Surgical, leading a team of human factors engineers working on our new platform that we just launched this year called ION. It's a robotically controlled catheter used to diagnose lung cancer.
And I'm Kelly Ashfield. I'm the Director of Program Management and Site Operations for Ximedica's San Francisco office. I have a background in about 15 years of medical device development, and Ximedica is a development firm, an outsourced product development firm that focuses in medical devices, diagnostics, drug delivery systems, and we do everything from early concept through short-term manufacturing and in some cases long-term manufacturing.
I'm Denise Zarins. I'm the CTO at the Fogarty Institute. It's an educational incubator located next door to El Camino Hospital in Mountain View. I have almost 25 years of experience developing products with a master's in biomedical engineering, mostly cardiovascular products and or energy delivery for a variety of indications.
Great. And before we get too far into the details of managing human factors as part of your product development process, I'd like to take a step back and just talk about design in general. It's something that, now that I've been involved in the design process, when I see examples of design that are not done well, it really annoys me. I've been in cars where the speedometer does not exactly line up with where I'm looking, and it just really irritates me. But let's be positive, and do you guys have examples of things that you think have been done well from a design standpoint? Not necessarily medicine, it's great if it's medicine, but just anything in general.
Yeah, it's a great question. So not a product that I've worked on, but I interact with daily. I drive a motorcycle as my primary method of transportation. And my motorcycle has a GPS unit, and they've come up with this really clever dial on the handlebars that allows me to interact with my GPS unit. And I appreciate that because it's very important to keep both hands on the handlebars when you're driving a motorcycle.
Yeah, I think it's really easy to come up with all the bad usability products out there because they're really frustrating. When something's amazing and usable, you don't even notice it most of the time because it's so intuitive. I think a really great one from the medical field is probably the AED, because that was one of the early devices that really took something that was pretty critical and life-saving, that's only used by physicians and trained medical professionals, into the hands of the users, and did it in a way that it took all the usability concerns out of that product. So you couldn't use it if it wasn't necessary. You couldn't harm anybody with that, and they really made that available to all the lay users.
I think the example that I have is also a transition of a very technical, complex medical device that's been redesigned for home use. And this is a negative pressure wound therapy device that's been developed here at the Fogarty Institute, where they took this highly skilled labor force that had to be highly trained and at these centers and provided oftentimes by the manufacturer to run these machines and provide negative pressure wound therapy. And this startup company said, we can do it better and much more inexpensively for low resource settings in, not only in the United States, but worldwide. And they took this very complex system and they brought it down to its barest necessities and also did appropriate on-device labeling and set up their user manual and quick use tools and YouTube videos to make it totally usable by an illiterate person at home. And it's a pretty amazing design that's really incredibly simple to use and equally effective to the complex and expensive systems that have historically been out there.
Yeah, and if you've seen me walking around, you'd realize that I had a usability issue with a knife and a cutting board last week, although it might have been user error. So just building on what you were saying there, Denise, can you each talk about why human factors and design for human factors is important? What value does it bring to a product? Is it strictly that it's just more pleasant to deal with, or like, what do you think?
So yeah, typically, I mean, when I think of usability as it relates to developing medical devices, it's really all around patient safety or user safety. And I think historically, looking at products, usability was done on a very ad hoc basis by physicians, maybe a couple KOLs that you might speak to, et cetera. But there are potentially more than one user that might be interfacing with your device. But really the key areas is patient safety or user safety. The second area is what we've kind of talked about, the nuisance factor. And having a product that nobody likes to use it could be inhibit adoption as much as anything else on this planet. And so I think looking at it from those two primary perspectives is how I kind of like to look at it.
And then just thinking through that lens of why it's important, how is it viewed in each of your organizations, right? So how do you handle human factors in your process? When does it come up? Who's involved?
So I don't work for any one company at the Fogarty Institute. We're sort of advising about 10 different companies. And what we try to instill in these folks, and most of them are seed stage or maybe on the verge of A rounds. And so very early stage product development, we try to encourage them extremely early on to focus on user needs, but in particular user needs as it relates to usability and human factors engineering. We try to get them to really think early on about the use environment, the different types of users that might use their device, and really start thinking about a task analysis very early on so that you can start thinking very early where things could go wrong and where those things could go wrong, how you could mitigate those things from going wrong. Again, primarily for patient safety, but secondarily just for ease of use and workflow.
Yeah, great questions. So human factors to me is important because there's more and more reports of healthcare provider burnout. And as we're introducing more and more high technology devices into their daily lives, we need to make sure that we're doubling down our efforts to make sure that those new technologies don't become a distractor and don't inhibit that ability for the provider and patient relationship to flourish. And so I think the second part of your question was, where is human factors? How is it structured at Intuitive? Human factors is a shared resource, meaning that the human factors professionals are all part of the same team, and we then get allocated to different projects. I think that's a good way to do it because it allows us to learn from one another, and it allows us to apply human factors principles consistently across all of the different product lines. And we're involved from the very, very beginning during the user need exploration phases. And as we're starting to get into product concepts, we're evaluating those concepts and helping to influence and iterate on the designs.
And most of our companies are very, very small, anywhere from one to a small handful of people. So in general, they've outsourced or found a good consultant that really knows the process of usability and creating the file that FDA and other regulators are going to look to see. But then internally, they have to absorb all that work internally on top of all the normal product development activities.
Yeah, Ximedica was actually founded by two industrial designers. So usability, human factors has always been really core to our basic principles and everything that we do. It's woven into the entire development process, similarly to Intuitive. start very early on in that concepting before there's a product to identify those user needs, to understand those use environments, and then woven in throughout the entire process, making sure that we're making design decisions early to account for usability, supporting all of the task analysis, the risks analysis, and driving formative and summative studies to show you're meeting all of those requirements in the long term.
Yeah, it's interesting to hear how things are structured across the companies, because we've got sort of three very different types of companies here, right? So early stage startups, through to very complex capital equipment, multinational company, and then Ximedica, we're sort of across the range of companies, but we're an outsourced design company. And so from each of your lenses and how you would like to see human factors incorporated into the design process, can you talk about where you see the errors come up, or where things kind of go astray when you bring in or when you're managing HF?
So the biggest mistake you can make is not starting early enough. Bringing in human factors at the very end of a project to run a validation study is not a recipe for success.
Yeah, coming in early is obviously huge. I think one of the things we see a lot with our clients, especially the smaller startups, is using their KOLs for everything and assuming that by using those KOLs, they're going to get the right usability feedback. And the reality is they tend to be the elite and they understand the processes, they have workarounds, and getting to the users that are the general population will uncover many more potential use risks throughout the process.
Yeah, I would agree with both of those. I think looking for the average user instead of just the KOLs is hugely important. Starting early and just committing to it early from the get-go, I think it's critical. Finding a mitigation, having to do a mitigation later after you've done V&V is super time-consuming and expensive. So most people are like, oh, we'll do it later. Oh, we'll fix that later. And it's really not the right way to do it. And I know cash-strapped startups have a very difficult time trying to incorporate every possible mitigation and design feature they want, but at least if you can be thoughtful and prioritize based on patient safety, I think that's the most critical thing.
Yeah. I mean, I've seen it a lot, right? Where a startup in particular will have a KOL in mind, and the use case of a KOL is certainly not the average case, right? So I'd agree with you. I think that's a mistake I see a lot.
And a big mistake is incorporating the user of for example, the device as in your summative testing and having them go through all the steps of using the device where they may not do all those steps. For example, reprocessing or unboxing and unpackaging, that might be done by a nurse or another staff member. And now you have a KOL who's clearly not going to read your user manual, right? Going into usability study, I don't know how to do that. I don't even do that part. And now you have to deal with that in your formal testing. So really thinking through all the different users is a common mistake in terms of not incorporating that properly into your summative testing or formative.
Right. And so there's a couple of terms that we're throwing around, and I don't necessarily want to be too patronizing, but we're talking about formative and summative studies. So I don't know if it's clear to everyone. Can you talk a little bit about what those are and what you're meant to get out of those studies, how they should work?
Sure, yeah. Formative studies are all of your early evaluations, and you're not supposed to have a perfect product. The intent of the formative studies, and the guidance actually says you're supposed to uncover those use errors and those risks that you haven't identified yet. And so you want to do those as often as possible to learn as much about the use environment, the design, and how you can make updates and changes to that design to have a really usable product. Summative?
Sure. Yep. So the summative is the big scary thing that you do at the very end of the project where everybody crosses their fingers and hopes that, no, if you've done the human factors process, summative studies should not be scary. And it's the validation. That's where you collect the objective evidence that people can use your device safely and effectively.
And I'd say the beauty is if your summative goes wrong, which is obviously not ideal, it just becomes a formative and you start over with another summative.
So thinking through a little bit about the formative and summative studies, do you have any examples of a formative study done well? Or I guess what I'm getting at is, how important is it to find the right population when you're doing your formative study, and how advanced does the device need to be when you're doing your formative? Like at what point should you start, considering doing a trial?
Yeah, I can share an example on that front. We had a product we were developing for a client. It was for an in-office use for a physician, and it was part of a kit. We were responsible for one part of that kit, but they were responsible for the packaging of the kit, all of the ancillary products, syringes, introducers, things of that nature. And we went into the formative study with our portion of that, but the kit itself was pretty underdeveloped. And it actually caused a lot of issues because that early unpacking, that setup of that product was really complicated. And because we hadn't had the kit formally laid out for those users, we came across so many potential use errors that, in fact, weren't real. It's just that we didn't have the right prototype for that part of the process.
So I guess you're saying the formative testing doesn't have to be soup to nuts unpackaging to final use, but you can kind of chip away at it based on where your device development is. I think I like doing it very early when there's something that someone has to hold in their hand and feel. I like to work with industrial designers to get prototypes of like version A, B, and C and get like really open-ended feedback on what feels good and not good about different shapes or how things are actuated and manipulated. I'd like to do that very early with lots of different options, and then you can get a lot of amazing feedback. I think one thing that's super important in formative testing, too, is to not lead the witness. A lot of times, if you let your lead engineer run the study, they have their own inherent biases of the design they like the best. And so I like to also bring in either someone from sales or marketing or clinical or even an outside person to help run those to make sure that the inherent bias of a lead engineer isn't incorporated into the study.
We use formative studies throughout, and I mean, we've done formative studies as early as we don't even have working software yet, but we'll have cardboard cutouts representing the pieces of information that could be displayed in the UI, and then have users place that on a square representing a monitor to kind of see where they would want to have information. And then, several months later, we conduct eye tracking research to show that that's a good layout. But the more you can do formative testing, the better. And as you get closer and closer to the end of the project, your formative evaluations take on a little bit more formality because you're getting closer to that validation study and you're starting to really poke a little bit harder on those critical tasks.
Two other things about formative testing is always take credit for them. A lot of times they can occur and nobody writes them down because they're not done like per a protocol with a report, but always make sure you capture those experiences because that adds to your overall design history file. And I think it's critically important to you can't write that stuff up afterwards, right? No one's going to remember the conversation. So make sure you take a little bit extra time to document those interactions.
Yeah, just building on that point, Denise, thinking through sort of the investment required to run, certainly some of these formative studies, can you give some idea of how big these studies need to be? Are we talking like 100 users or, generally like what is good enough data?
I come from cash-strapped startups, so just enough.
Right.
Enough until you can feel you're getting relatively consistent answers, right? I mean, you iterate, you maybe do a smaller sample size, but then as you get closer to the final design, I think you might want to add additional users before you go into your summative and native users too, people that you didn't ask last time, right? You want brand new users as much as possible. And so the other key thing is any labeling or user manual or training that they would have to interface with as part of leading up to assessing whether or not they make use errors. Don't wait till the last minute to write those either. And a lot of times they're written for regulatory purposes primarily and other things. But if it's something that the user is going to have to read and comprehend prior to actually using your device, I wouldn't put that off to the last minute.
Yeah, we're often flying physicians and surgeons in from around the country and sometimes even with their support staff, so circulating nurses and scrub techs. So when they're on campus, we really try to make the most out of that encounter. And they'll likely be participating in formative sessions for probably 3 or 4 or 5 different products throughout the course of the day.
I think one important thing to point out is that the FDA guidance doesn't require any sample sizes for formative studies. They do for summative studies, but it gives you a lot of flexibility for formatives to run those as lean as possible. There is some guidance in HE75 that says, I think you can find 85-90% of use errors with probably 6 to 8 users. So in many cases, you can get that information really quickly with a small user group. And a lot of times we do early research in-house with not potentially the users of the device, but if you're looking at ergonomics, fit, how something feels in your hand, you can utilize some of your in-house staff, whether it's a secretary or an engineer or a researcher, just to say, how does this feel? Do you like the feel of this device? And that's a good way to kind of pare down some of the cost and make some quick progress early.
Yeah, that's a good point. Some of our systems need to be transported between ORs, and you don't necessarily need to have a scrub tech do that, but if you have a wide range of anthropometric body types that you have access to in your working environment, you can just have those people push stuff around also.
Yeah, it's a good point about, not every formative study needs a very specific user profile. Have you ever come across a study that does require a specific user type? And how important is it to find a very specific user profile?
Yeah, I'd say once you get further along in that process, you want to understand who those users are so they can understand that use environment and really identify those potential use failures. Early on, if you are marketing the product in the US, you'll have to do your summative study in the US, but you can actually utilize markets in other countries if that's going to cut costs to make things a little easier on that front. So there's some opportunities there. But you have to identify all the potential user groups, the nurses who are setting it up, the reprocessing technicians, and those are all really vital parts of that process. But it's right size based on risk. So if there's high risk in the early setup, it's something that you're definitely gonna have to spend more time in. If it's relatively low risk, there might be less critical tasks that you don't need to evaluate and spend as much time on in that process.
Yeah, and you need to be careful about your screening criteria for your participants. You may want to see how an English as a second language, colorblind, left-handed circulator nurse might interact with your device, but trying to recruit a few of those to do that is going to take you a little bit longer than it would be just to recruit normal folks.
So we've talked a little bit about the regulatory side of things. Obviously, that's a very important component of this. How do you guys each think about engaging the FDA? When do you bring them in, if ever? And when do you think it's appropriate to engage them in some of the HF issues?
Yeah, we view the FDA as an ally. We collaborate with them quite frequently. We take advantage of the pre-submission process. We'll submit usability validation plans to get feedback to make sure that we're covering all the bases that they expect us to cover. And so, yeah, we engage with them early and often.
I would say in startup realm, we encourage and we interface with the FDA frequently from the perspective of pre-subs and things of that nature. I have yet to come across a very early stage company that has proactively done a pre-sub solely to discuss usability plans and usability assessments and summative testing and some of those types of things. But the FDA has become an incredibly friendly place to engage with, and I have seen it, and it is really important to do that. If you think you have something out of the ordinary, or maybe you have a population that's going to be super hard to recruit, and you want to propose an alternate, broader methodology for enrolling that summative testing, you may want to go out and do that. But I personally have not needed to do that for usability, more for clinical evidence development and things like that.
Sure. It's probably a decent point to open it up to the audience here. Any questions from the audience?
How do the KOLs typically react when you do seek opinions from other clinicians? Do they dismiss that feedback, or they find it insightful?
I don't know that I've ever had a situation where that's come up, to be honest. But I don't know, Kevin.
We've not had it come up, even though the KOLs were aware that we were testing with other folks. It's more internal resistance to not using KOLs that I've personally encountered.
The only time I've seen it as a product is evolving over time was a user interface that we originally had for RDN. It's a RF generator, so we had a bunch of what I would term now engineering data on it early days, and a lot of our early adopters got really used to that and enjoyed that experience of interpreting all this information that was really put there for engineers to determine whether or not it was a good therapy. And electrophysiologists love that because that's really normal as part of their normal cardiac ablations. But then as we were redesigning for the broader environment, we dumbed down the display to the minimal required information. And we did get some resistance from KOLs then who had gotten used to it. And so that's a cautionary tale in terms of giving early adopters much more information than you would plan to put on a commercial embodiment. And, I mean, you just got to work with them and bring them along. At one point, we had an option where they could go back to the old version. So if they preferred that, they could still get to it. But the new version was the default.
In the back there.
Yeah, for small companies, how have you dealt with some of the guidance around simulated real-world use environments? I mean, that's a very broad thing that can be read a lot of ways.
Yeah.
Everyone doesn't have a mock OR or a hospital they can just borrow once in a while. How do you deal with that?
Yeah, I mean, that can be challenging for these startups. A lot of the companies we have at the Institute are either home use or not necessarily like a piece of operating equipment. But we have had one where they literally went and found a simulation lab that was outside existing that was used for training purposes, and they were able to leverage somebody else's lab. In other cases, they'll work with, again, an outside consultant and just convert basically a conference room into, essentially, a mock simulated environment. There's also, I mean, with all the appropriate, background noise and ambient noise, the right amount of lighting and things like that. Sometimes you can leverage animal labs in order to set up a mock environment as well. They'll charge you for the time to use the room, but you don't necessarily have to do an animal study to use their facilities. And so, yeah, and sometimes the KOLs will help facilitate getting access to rooms within even their clinics or hospitals to help you evaluate that stuff. But it can be a real challenge, and developing a simulated use test bed in and of itself is a huge project that a lot of people wait way too long to start thinking about.
Yeah, Ximedica actually has 2 usability labs in our Minnesota and Providence offices, and we set those up, whether it's an OR, an office environment, home environment, and so we have a lot of flexibility to use that as much as possible. We've even done a product that was intended for battlefield use where the lights were low, they had big gloves on, we had loud noises, distractions to really kind of simulate that environment as much as we possibly could in an office environment. But you can do a lot in a square room if you have a little bit of extra time and some props to set those up.
And I would just emphasize, focus on recreating the environmental conditions that would affect the way that the device is used. So if you can't find a room that has a tile floor, but it's not going to affect the way that your device is used, then maybe you don't need a tile floor.
Question on the product development side, on design control. For what you currently use your design control, do you think that it satisfies, or are there gaps, or what would you change about the design?
I think human factors and usability is really woven into all of our design controls. It starts with our risk process, making sure we're understanding the usability risk, all those use steps. I think that the regulations are pretty clear on their expectations for protocols and reports and activities that will need to be done to support that. So I think as an organization, I'm pretty comfortable with where we are from a design control perspective. And how that supports the design changes and development. Our FMEAs, for example, call out usability studies, validations, and formatives where necessary, and they have new design mitigations that are put in place based on things we learn in formatives. And so that adds to our file as we go along. They're living documents, and they grow on a daily basis throughout the process.
I think for startups, if you're kind of newer to coming into usability, like historical design control documents are relatively silent, right, on the whole process of doing the usability and all of the key activities and deliverables that are now expected in your HFE file. And so while the HFE file for the regulatory submission is very prescribed in terms of what they expect to see, there's not a lot of inherent understanding, for lack of a better phrase, of where those things should be done within your existing phased approach of design control. And so I recently was talking to a human factors expertise, and they have their own usability SOP, and I asked them to say, well, how do I map this separate SOP into my regular design control so that I have all the right things in my project plan for design, research phase, design phase, development phase, and validation phases. And they hadn't clearly done that themselves. And so it was very interesting to kind of go through that exercise and think about where these activities should begin. And it really does begin almost in phase 0, to be honest. It really should, and carry through. But I would just lay out in your project plan what deliverables you need when to make sure you hit all the key deliverables and describe that HFE process. Oh, and some people do have their own SOPs. I'm leaning towards embedding it in my own design control one and having one stop shop, but I'm a startup, so I can do whatever I want.
There's a technical report from Amy, TIR 59, I believe, that does a nice job outlining the human factors activities throughout the design controls process.
Any other questions from the audience? Sure.
I have a specific question for Helen. You mentioned you work on ion system. On market, there's another company doing the Monarch system there. So for the user interaction part, myself, I've been looking at the solutions of both companies. It's very interesting. You really came out with this small portable console or card, however you want to call that, and then also the track log. So I'm sure you've looked at other solutions in the market today, and could you give some justifications on why this card as additional part that has to roll around the room and also like track log? Like a lot of these designs don't quite make sense. Like I'm trying to wrap my head around like why. So maybe you have some insights you can share.
Sure. Yep. So for those that are not familiar, the ion system has the main cart component that controls the catheter, and then there's a separate cart that almost looks like it's about the size of a Mayo stand that has the navigation controls on it. And we went with that versus the Xbox controller, which is what Monarch went with, because when we analyzed the workflow, we noticed and came to the realization that users would be frequently going between the controls and inserting biopsy tools into the working channel. And so not having to go and put down a controller and then remember where that handheld controller was, we felt that it would be important to have a controller that stayed at the driving position, for lack of a better term. And also we were concerned about dropping the controller, which is something that Monarch has observed with theirs.
All right, we'll keep thinking of some questions. We've focused a lot on formative studies so far, so let's move a little bit forward and talk a little bit about summative studies. Can you talk about when it's appropriate to go to a summative study? Is there times where you can just do a couple of formatives and bypass the summative altogether? What is the sort of the rationale about moving to a summative, and how do you right size your effort so that you don't always have to go, or are there cases where you don't have to go to all the way through to a summative?
So whether or not you do a summative is really dependent on your use risk analysis and whether or not you have any critical tasks. Any task where if a user malinteraction has the potential to cause a serious injury to themselves or to the patient, you're obligated to do a usability validation on. When you're working on an update to a non-market product, again, you just look to see whether or not you're affecting any of those critical tasks or introducing any additional critical tasks, and that will determine whether or not you have to do a validation. But either way, you'd still want to do formatives to see if those changes are introducing any unanticipated opportunities for use risk.
Also, for early stage companies going to a first in human release, right? You're going to release your product initially to their first in human. It's clearly not your commercial embodiment. So you would probably go into a first in human with just formative testing. You wouldn't do a summative test, most likely for that. It's more at the time of the regulatory submission at the end versus at the time of clinical trial.
All right. And I suppose, we've talked a lot about where things are now. For the last couple of minutes here, let's think a little bit about the future. Where do you see things moving to in sort of the HF world? Do you see things changing quite a bit? Even in your day-to-day experience, are you seeing things a lot differently now that you didn't see, 2, 3, 5 years ago? Where do you see this field moving?
I think from a regulatory perspective, it's been really interesting because it's been such a focus for so many years now. And the industry as a whole, I think, has proven that we understand the guidance, we understand the expectations. We've made a lot of progress in the human factors and usability front. I also think the FDA is probably really inundated with human factors assessment. And so I think moving forward, you'll probably see some changes from the FDA's perspective as far as how in-depth they're going to go into reviewing your usability and human factors files. Certainly the process is in place and the expectation would be to follow that. But I see them probably scaling back, reassessing the high-risk devices, probably looking for more summaries rather than detailed execution strategies for your human factors work.
I'm starting to hear some rumblings from outside of the United States of countries perhaps expecting to have in-region usability validations and not just accepting usability validations that have been done with US users and applying that directly to other markets, especially Asia.
From a technical perspective, I'm seeing a lot more devices and a lot more people going through redesigning devices for lower skilled staff to be using them. And I see that as a trend. And I'm seeing a ton more like point of care type devices and a ton more home healthcare devices. And I think those two areas are, from an engineering perspective, new challenges that we'll be embarking on more and more now with technology becoming part of daily life.
Any last questions? If not, I might close up with just one last question for the panel here. So given everything that we've talked about, if you had one piece of advice to leave everyone with, what would you say? You can say the same thing.
Start early.
Start early.
Start early, and users love being included in the process of creating new products and new technology. So oftentimes, especially with medical professionals, there's more intrinsic value in that than they'll get from any honorariums that you can pay them.
And then people, staff and nurses, I mean, you can get them pretty readily if you make sure, try to be on site where they work so they don't have to travel to you. Giving them a little compensation works really well. And with lay people, giving them a little compensation, it gets people to sign up and enroll and be part of your studies pretty readily for not a lot of money.
We got one question, I think. Is that a question?
Yeah, so that was an interesting question you just asked about going international, right? So Asia, Europe, everybody's kind of been making noises about different changing requirements. And then there was a comment that it's going to be a lot of work. How much does training play into human factors? Can training be the stopgap? Can you design that to, you have a different Asian training, you have a different European training, but the same product?
Well, I mean, training is important, and it's certainly really valuable, but if you can't guarantee that all your users are going to experience that training, you can't fall back on that as a reason to not address potential use errors.
Yeah, my understanding is it's the worst solution for solving, to use as a mitigation, yeah.
But still an important part of the user interface.
Sure.
Probably is a stupid question, but if you're a startup putting money into the design of a product, is that reflected ultimately in if your company is acquired by Strategic? Do they put value into the design you put into their product, or is it just like, I don't know, fixing the basement in your house? No one's going to give you, you're not going to get a resale value for that as opposed to some stainless steel appliance that you know.
I've been bought by Medtronic multiple times, and they dug very deeply into my design history files.
Yeah, I think
Painfully deep, yeah.
having strong design controls and design history files is huge. We've seen that with some of the clients we've worked with where we've coached them through the process, and at the end of the day, when they were acquired, they were thankful that we kind of led them down that path because it made them a much more desirable acquisition, a much easier acquisition, and much higher value.
And the strategics feel like what you've built is repeatable, right? And that you've done all the right things to verify that it functions as intended. They've been burned multiple times by buying things that didn't maybe have such good design controls. And then when they try to transfer it into their own operations, they were unable to build it, right? And so their radar is way higher than, I've always had a pretty deep dive, always.
Yeah, it's not a dumb question at all. It's I was at Medtronic when we acquired Denise's company, and I can say that the expectation is that the bar is going to be a lot higher for a multinational than it is for a startup, right? So you definitely want the design history file and everything fully baked. And that does affect the acquisition price generally. It's at least a factor. And then the other side is, you're looking at what it's going to take to actually bring this asset in and commercialize it, right? And in a lot of cases, there's probably going to be a redesign involved, if the due diligence says, well, we don't really think it's usable, right? Just like you would do your due diligence on manufacturability, if there's going to be a redesign for any purpose, that gets factored into your financial calculation. All right, well, anything else? Thank you for all your questions, and thank you, panel, for your expertise. We're getting you out 2-3 minutes early, but if you have any questions, we'll be around.